I worked the overnight shift at a fast food chain for about 6 months. It was the kind of job no one really wanted, so you'd end up working with some odd characters, both co-workers and customers. At the time I was 24, sharing a tiny apartment with 2 friends, and this was the only way I could pay my bills while trying to get my life back on track after dropping out of college. My routine was monotonous: catch the bus at 10 p.m., get to the restaurant by 11 p.m., and spend the night handing out orders at the drive-thru. There wasn't much traffic at night, mostly truckers, partygoers, or people who were clearly drunk and just wanted a quick bite. That week, something started to feel off. One night, around 2 a.m., I noticed a black car slowly driving through the drive-thru lane, but the driver never stopped at the order window. They just cruised by, almost like they were looking inside, and then drove off. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. Weird stuff happened all the time during my shift, but the next night, the same car came back, doing the exact same thing. This time, the driver briefly parked in one of the dark corners of the lot, staying there for about 5 minutes before leaving. I mentioned it to Sam, the overnight security guy, but he just laughed it off, saying I was imagining things. On the 3rd night, the car came back. By then, I was actively watching for it. It was an old black sedan, with a loose front bumper that swayed slightly as it moved. The driver never rolled down the window, and the darkness made it impossible to see their face. They drove even slower this time, nearly stopping at the drive-thru window, but once again didn't order anything. My stomach churned with unease. I told my manager, Mark, about it, but he just shrugged and said, "Some people just like to mess around. Don't sweat it." I wanted to believe him, but something about this felt different. The next night, while I was cleaning the counter between orders, I heard the car before I saw it. That familiar, uneven rumble of the engine had etched itself into my memory. I froze, barely breathing, as the car looped around the parking lot and parked in that same shadowy corner. This time it stayed there for almost 15 minutes. I swear I could feel someone watching me, even though the restaurant doors were locked. When the car finally left, I went to the window hoping to catch the license plate, but the glare from the lights and the distance made it impossible to see clearly. My heart was racing, but I kept trying to convince myself it was all in my head. On the 5th night, when the car showed up again, I decided to do something about it. During a lull between orders, I checked the security camera feed that pointed toward the parking lot. To my surprise, the camera had been tilted upward, pointing at the ceiling. It was strange because, as far as I knew, only Mark had access to the camera controls. My discomfort grew into outright fear. I mentioned it to Sam again, but he just laughed and said, "Night shifts can mess with your head, man." Later that night, I found the note. I was crouched under the counter, wiping it down, when my hand brushed against something rough. It was a folded piece of paper, tucked into the corner where it was almost invisible. The paper was yellowed and dirty, as if it had been there for days. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were the words, "I know your schedule." My whole body froze. Someone had been inside the restaurant. Worse, they knew exactly when I'd be there. I looked around, trying to recall if I'd left any doors unlocked or if someone could have slipped in unnoticed. But it didn't make sense. All the doors were locked at night, and only employees had the keys. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could have left the note? And more importantly, when? The restaurant wasn't large, and I was always aware of the few customers who came in during the night. The idea that someone had slipped in without me noticing was terrifying. I showed the note to Mark the next evening, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably a prank by another employee. "Don't let it get to you," he said. But it was easy for him to say. He wasn't the one working alone overnight with a security guard who didn't seem to care. That night, I stayed on high alert. During every break between orders, I walked around the restaurant, checking all the doors, windows, and even the hidden corners. Around 3 a.m., I heard a strange noise coming from the storage room. It was a faint scraping sound, low and continuous, like something sharp dragging along the wall. My heart pounded as I grabbed the metal baton Sam kept near the entrance and walked toward the storage room, trying not to make a sound. When I opened the door, everything seemed normal. The shelves and boxes were untouched, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something scratched into the wall. The words, "I'm watching you," were etched into the concrete, barely visible in the dim light. After seeing those words carved into the wall, I froze. I didn't know if I should scream, call Sam, or just run. In the end, I decided to act like nothing had happened and finished my shift as quickly as possible. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I walked by the drive-through window, I half expected the black car to be there, lurking in the shadows. But that night, it didn't show up, and for a brief moment I thought maybe it was all in my head. The next evening when I arrived for my shift, something felt off. Mark, the manager, was already there, reviewing the security footage. He looked uneasy, which was odd for someone who usually brushed things off so easily. "The cameras caught something strange last night," he said without looking up. I leaned in to see the footage. At around 4 a.m., while I was cleaning the drive-through area, a hooded figure briefly appeared on one of the outdoor cameras. It was too dark to see their face, but they were holding something in their hand. Something that looked like a knife or a crowbar. The worst part? They weren't in the parking lot. They were inside the fenced area just a few feet from the back door of the restaurant. My breath hitched as I watched the footage. "And no one saw this live?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark shook his head, looking pale. "The cameras were recording, but the live monitor at the front desk was off. Must have been a technical glitch," he said, though I could tell he didn't believe his own explanation. Someone had come dangerously close to the building, armed, and no one noticed. The thought made me nauseous. That night, I decided to stay on edge. I kept the metal baton within reach and double-checked every door and window at least 3 times. Around 3:30 a.m., the silence was broken by a loud thud against the back door. It sounded like someone had kicked it or slammed something heavy against it. My heart raced as adrenaline coursed through me. Gripping the baton, I made my way to the door, watching the security monitor that showed the back alley. But to my surprise, no one was there. I was about to head back to the counter when I heard another noise, a faint scraping, like metal against metal. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door. Outside, the alley was empty under the flickering streetlight. But lying on the ground just outside the door was a white envelope with my name scrawled on it in the same handwriting as the first note. My hands were trembling as I picked up the envelope, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. But curiosity, or maybe fear of the unknown, got the better of me. Inside was a single folded piece of paper with a message even more unsettling than the last. "If you open the door again, I won't be so kind." My entire body went cold. Someone was watching me, closely enough to know my every move. I slammed the door shut and locked every bolt, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. As for Sam, nowhere to be found. Of course, he was always taking his extended breaks, but that night, his absence felt more deliberate than ever. The next few hours were spent in a state of constant dread. Every sound, every shadow felt like a warning that something worse was coming. By the time 5 a.m. rolled around and the morning shift started to arrive, I felt a wave of relief at not being alone anymore. I showed the envelope to Mark, who for once didn't brush it off. He said he'd look into it and told me to stay calm, but the look on his face said he had no idea what to do. As I left the restaurant that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. My heart didn't settle until I was back home, but even then, my sleep was filled with nightmares of doors banging and shadows that moved on their own. The next night, I walked into work, knowing it would be my last shift. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed the job, but this had gone way beyond anything I'd ever expected. Before I even started, I told Mark I was quitting. He didn't try to argue, just nodded and said he understood. My only task that night was to train the guy taking over my shift, but all I wanted was to get through the hours quietly and leave without looking back. Everything was calm at first, but then, around 2 a.m., the black car showed up again. This time the car didn't just creep through the drive-thru, it stopped directly in front of the window. My entire body froze as I saw the driver for the first time. The window was down, and they were wearing a blank white mask. No expression, no features, just a plain, eerie face staring back at me. They didn't say anything, didn't move. They just sat there watching. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the headset. After what felt like an eternity, the car suddenly sped off, disappearing into the night and leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. That was all I needed to confirm I'd made the right decision. The following morning, as I packed up my things for the last time, I noticed something tucked under the counter where I'd found the first note. It was another piece of paper, with a new message. You made the right choice. It didn't bring me any relief, only a deep, lingering unease. To this day, I don't know who was behind all of it or what they wanted, but every time I see a black car passing slowly by, I feel a chill down my spine and wonder if, somehow, they're still watching. I work as a librarian at a small, old library in the city center. There's something charming about working there, surrounded by books that carry decades, sometimes centuries, of stories. Normally, the night shift is peaceful. After the doors close at 6 p.m., I stay behind to organize, catalog, and plan upcoming events. That was the routine until a few weeks ago, when things started to happen. At the time, I was dealing with a recently donated collection, spending hours in the dusty aisles filling out forms and checking catalog numbers. Everything seemed normal, or so I thought. The first time I heard the sound, it was so faint I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, came from the farthest shelves. My first instinct was to ignore it. It was late, nearly 10 p.m., and I was tired. But as the nights went on, the whispers seemed to return, always in the same section, the part of the library dedicated to books on occultism and ancient mysteries. It must be my imagination, I told myself, trying to focus on my work. But on the fourth consecutive night, as I passed that section, I found something odd. A bookmark left inside a dusty, obscure book that hadn't been touched in years. Written on it, in slanted, uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'm watching you." Nay, I stared at the bookmark for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some prank by one of the younger patrons, but the book it was in was from 1923, a rare edition on ancient rituals that no one had checked out in years. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd seen it off the shelf. I put the bookmark in the drawer of my desk and tried to go back to work, but the phrase lingered in my mind. Who could have left it there? And why? That night, as I locked up the library, I glanced back at the dark and cramped aisles, feeling a strange chill crawl up my spine. It felt like the rows of shelves were different, more oppressive. The next night, something else happened. As soon as I entered, I noticed one of the book carts in the middle of the aisle near the occult section. I was sure I had left it in the storage room the night before. When I checked the books on it, I saw they all belonged to that same collection of ancient mysteries. Each had a bookmark inside with unsettling messages like, "You'll find out," "I know you're here," and "You shouldn't." My heart raced. I checked the security cameras, but they'd been offline for months, an issue I'd been putting off fixing. Desperate, I turned to the entry and exit logs. That's when my stomach sank. There was a log of someone entering at 9:30 p.m. the previous night, but no record of them leaving. I broke out in a cold sweat. Who had entered the library after hours? And more importantly, where were they now? I looked around, trying to hear anything unusual, but the silence was almost suffocating. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check the aisles. I wanted to believe someone had just hidden by accident or as a prank. But as I passed the occult section, I thought I heard faint footsteps. Yet when I shone the flashlight in that direction, no one was there. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid and attempted to get back to work. But as I was cataloging another batch of books, I felt something I'd never felt before: the distinct sensation of being watched. It was as if a pair of eyes were fixed on me, studying me. My desk was in an open corner near the children's section, so there was nowhere to hide. Even so, I turned around quickly, hoping to catch someone in the act. Nothing. The emptiness stared back at me. I opened the drawer and pulled out the bookmark from the previous night, examining it again, hoping for some clue. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a faint, dusty handprint on the paper. My grip on the bookmark tightened as my mind raced. The handprint was so subtle I'd almost missed it, but it looked massive, with unnaturally long fingers. I shone my flashlight under the desk, as if that would help, but all I saw was the reflection of the light on the polished wooden floor. I decided I needed to finish up early that night. Something was very wrong, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but as I passed the occult section, I tripped over something. When the flashlight beam landed on the floor, my heart almost stopped. It wasn't a book this time, but another bookmark. This one had a more chilling message: "You're getting closer." My body tensed. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the rational part of my mind insisted I needed to understand what was going on. I picked up the bookmark with trembling fingers, like it was contaminated, and hurried back to my desk. I unlocked the computer and reopened the logs, searching for any patterns or clues I might have overlooked. The logs revealed something that froze my blood. There was a pattern. The after-hours entries always happened between 9:25 p.m. and 9:35 p.m., but on alternating nights. However, they didn't follow a chronological order. They seemed to appear on random dates, without any apparent logic. Some weeks had several entries, while others passed without any. I tried to recall if I'd ever noticed anything before, but I couldn't. Maybe I'd been so used to my routine that I never realized it. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was like the noise of a book falling to the floor, coming from one of the farthest sections. I froze in my chair, unable to move. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to grab my flashlight again. I followed the sound with slow, calculated steps, trying to make as little noise as possible. The aisle where the sound seemed to have come from was dark, with a single flickering light overhead. When the flashlight beam illuminated the floor, my heart nearly stopped. There wasn't a book on the ground, but another bookmark. This time the message was more direct: "You're making a mistake." I wanted to run right then and there, but something bigger, maybe curiosity or a need to understand, made me stay. I picked up the bookmark, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold it. As I turned to go back to my desk, I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a book falling, but footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, as if something or someone were walking through one of the distant aisles. The sound echoed through the silent library, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Instinctively, I turned off the flashlight, trying to hide in the darkness. My heart was beating so loudly it felt like it would give me away. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped entirely. Everything fell into an oppressive silence. I was crouched behind a shelf, barely breathing, when I felt something rush past me fast, like a cold draft of air. I couldn't hold back a small gasp. As soon as I did, a low, raspy laugh echoed through the library, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The laugh lingered in the air, every note filled with malicious intent. My body was frozen. I couldn't even breathe properly. I decided at that moment that no matter what was happening, I had to get out of there. Carefully, I began to crawl away from the shelves, trying not to make a sound. That's when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. The main library door, which I'd locked at the start of my shift, made a faint creak, as if it had been opened. Panic flooded my mind. I knew no one else had the key but me and the library director, who only came during the day. I grabbed the flashlight and crawled back to the reception desk where my bag was. The plan was simple: grab the keys and make a run for the emergency exit. But when I got there, my stomach sank. My keys weren't where I had left them. In their place was another bookmark. This one was different from the others. It was soaked in what looked like dried blood, and the message written on it said, "I see you." Those words paralyzed me. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this wasn't just playing games. It knew exactly where I was. I grabbed the flashlight again, turning it on without thinking. The beam of light swept through the shelves, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move between the books. It wasn't human, at least not completely. The shadow was elongated, slender, as if its arms and legs were unnaturally long. I took a deep breath and ran in the opposite direction, toward the emergency exit. It was my only chance to get out and find help. But as I passed one of the shelves, I heard a whispered voice, so close it felt like it was in my ear. "Why run? You're already mine." The voice was raspy, almost inhuman, yet at the same time, familiar. I can't explain how, but it felt like it knew every thought in my head, as if it were inside my mind. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor, dropping the flashlight. The light spun around the aisle, and for a split second illuminated something that made me scream. Glowing red eyes staring at me from between the shelves. My scream echoed through the library but seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence. Those eyes stayed there, staring at me, unmoving, while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. I don't know how I managed to get up, but my legs finally obeyed, and I ran. I didn't look back, even though I could feel something getting closer with every step I took. I reached the emergency exit and pushed the door with all my strength, but it didn't budge. Locked. Desperation hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to remember any detail, anything that could help. That's when I realized the emergency system only unlocked the door if the alarm was activated. I ran to the panel on the wall, but before I could press the button, I felt an icy presence behind me, so cold that my skin prickled instantly. Slowly, I turned my head and saw something that still haunts me to this day. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the aisle. It was tall, slender, with a face covered by something that looked like a grotesque mask made of book pages. The edges of the pages fluttered as if alive, and those glowing red eyes shone through the holes in the mask. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. That thing stayed motionless for a moment, as if it were studying me. It was surreal, as if time had stopped. Then, in one swift, fluid motion, it stepped toward me. That was enough to snap me out of my trance. I slammed the alarm button with all my strength. The deafening sound began to echo through the library, shattering the silence, and for a moment, I thought it might drive the creature away. But it didn't retreat. On the contrary, it tilted its head, as if curious, and started moving closer, faster. Without thinking, I ran back toward the main desk, hoping to find anything I could use to defend myself or call the police. My mind was in chaos, and my vision blurred from the panic. When I reached the desk, I knocked over papers and books, searching for something useful. That's when my hand landed on something cold and metallic. A spare key hidden among the piles of documents. It was for the main door. My heart raced with a mix of hope and fear. I grabbed the key and ran again, the creature's footsteps echoing louder and closer behind me. My hands were shaking so much that I nearly dropped the key while trying to unlock the main door. The footsteps grew louder, faster, and I could feel that presence, that almost supernatural cold closing in. When I finally managed to turn the key and open the door, I didn't hesitate. I bolted out into the empty street, not daring to look back. The night air felt different, heavy, as if the entire city was suffocating under the terror that seemed to follow me. But to my surprise, as soon as I crossed the threshold, the sound of footsteps stopped. Everything fell into an almost deafening silence, except for the echo of my pounding heart. I turned around, still gasping for air, expecting to see the figure standing there at the library entrance. But there was nothing. The aisle was empty, the interior lights flickering slightly as if nothing had happened. Yet something was different. The door, which I had left open, began to slowly close on its own, as if an invisible hand was pushing it shut. I ran to the nearest corner, desperate to put distance between me and the building, and called the police with trembling fingers. When they arrived, everything was in order. No bookmarks, no sign of intrusion, nothing in the logs to prove what I had seen. The officers conducted a quick search, checking every aisle, but, as I feared, they found nothing out of place. Even the bookmarks had disappeared. I insisted they check the digital records, but the system appeared to have been reset. All the entry and exit times were wiped, as if someone had erased any evidence. I tried explaining what had happened, but the looks I got were skeptical. One officer even suggested I might be tired or stressed, as if my mind had fabricated the whole thing. After they left, I sat on the curb outside the library, still in shock. The night was cold, but I barely felt the temperature. My hands were still trembling, and the feeling of being watched hadn't completely gone away. For a moment I looked up at the library windows and could almost swear I saw something moving inside, between the shelves. But before I could be sure, the lights flickered off all at once, plunging the building into darkness. Since that night, I've never worked the night shift again. I requested a transfer to the daytime schedule and avoid even walking near the library after dark. I worked as a waitress in a small family diner in a quiet town in the middle of nowhere. It was a classic place, with red leather booths, a jukebox that barely worked, and that constant smell of coffee that seemed to cling to your clothes. I was 24 at the time, just trying to make ends meet while figuring out what to do with my life. My shifts were usually at night, starting around 6 and ending at midnight when we closed. It was a pretty peaceful job, with the same regulars almost every night. But there was one guy who started to stand out. He'd come in alone around 10 p.m., always ordering the same thing, apple pie with black coffee. At first he seemed like just another lonely soul killing time. As the weeks went by, though, he became noticeable in a way that made me uneasy. He never gave his name, and I never asked, but something about him was off. He always wore a black leather jacket, even on warm nights, and had this way of looking at you from under his eyebrows that felt like he was analyzing everything at once. He started asking questions about me, questions that went beyond casual chit-chat. "Do you live around here? Been working here long?" They sounded innocent at first, but there was a tone to them I couldn't quite explain. One night, after he left, I noticed he had left something on the counter along with his receipt, a folded piece of paper. On it, in messy handwriting, were the words, "I see you." That night, I went home with that note stuck in my head. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a bad joke or some weird way of flirting, but I couldn't shake the tone of those words. The next night, he came back. This time, he stayed even longer. The diner was nearly empty when he started asking more personal questions. "Do you live alone? Isn't it dangerous going home so late?" I gave vague, polite answers, trying to sound firm but not rude. When he left another note with his receipt. This time it read, You're even prettier up close." My stomach turned. I spent the rest of the shift with a growing sense of dread. Over the following week, he showed up every night without fail. He lingered longer and longer, watching me clean tables or serve other customers. I started to notice he never left until I did, always slipping out quietly after me. I told my manager about it, but he shrugged it off. "He's just a weird customer," he said. "Working late attracts these kinds of people." But Friday night, it escalated. We closed at midnight and I walked out the back door to head to my car. That's when I saw his car parked across the street. The engine was off, but the headlights were on, pointed directly at me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or maybe he lived nearby. But that car, with its headlights on, felt like it was watching me. I got into my own car quickly, locking the doors. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and my heart sank. He was standing outside the diner on the sidewalk, like he was waiting for something. His black jacket gleamed under the streetlights, and he was completely still, like a statue. I put my car in gear and drove off, trying not to look rushed. Deep down, though, I knew something was very wrong. The next few nights, he didn't show up. On one hand, I felt relieved, but on the other, his absence felt more unsettling than his presence. I started noticing strange things. My phone would ring, but no one was on the other end. One evening, I came home to find footprints in the dirt near my bedroom window. It could have been anything, but my gut told me it was him. I finally went to the police, explaining everything. The notes, the questions, the car. The officer was polite but skeptical. Without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I went home more on edge than ever. I tried to sleep, but every little noise felt amplified, like the whole house was conspiring against my peace. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, footsteps on the gravel. My heart raced, but I tried to rationalize it. "It's probably an animal or the wind," I told myself. But then came the sound of metal scraping, like someone trying to open the back door. Grabbing my phone, I locked myself in the bathroom and called the police. The operator said a patrol car was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. When the sirens finally arrived, the noises outside stopped. The police searched the area but found no one. However, they did find something that made my blood run cold. A note taped to the back door handle. It read, "You shouldn't have called for help." I showed the note to the officers, but without a clear suspect, they couldn't do much. They advised me to change my routines and stay vigilant. The warning felt more than just vague. It was personal. I knew he was watching me, and it terrified me. I decided not to return to work. I called my manager, made up some excuse about needing time off, and spent the day figuring out my next move. Should I find a new place to live? Leave town entirely? It felt extreme, but the constant feeling of being watched made it impossible to think straight. That night I got a text from an unknown number that made my stomach drop. It said, "Nice new house, great view from the window." I froze. It didn't make sense. I hadn't moved. Or did it? Unable to sleep, I spent the whole night watching out the window. Around 4 a.m., I heard the gravel again. This time, I decided to act. I called the police and grabbed a kitchen knife, hiding in the hallway with a partial view of the back door. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. When the sirens approached, the sound outside stopped. The police found nothing again, except for muddy handprints on the glass of the back door. I packed my things the next day and drove to my parents' house 2 hours away. I didn't tell them much, just that I needed a break from work and a safe place to stay. For a few days, things were quiet. Then, a note appeared on my dad's car windshield. It said, "You can't run forever." I gave it to the local police, and they finally started taking things seriously. They installed security cameras around the house, and I stayed inside as much as possible. The sense of being watched never left me. A week later, The cameras caught something. In the middle of the night, a car stopped in front of the house. The same model I'd seen outside the diner with its headlights on. A figure stepped out and stood in the street, staring at the house. Though I couldn't see clearly, the black jacket was unmistakable. After a few minutes, he got back in the car and drove away. The police traced the plates and found they belonged to a man with a history of stalking. He was located a few days later but denied everything, claiming I was imagining things. Still, they issued a restraining order, and I haven't seen him since. Even now, I find myself looking over my shoulder whenever I leave the house. I still don't know what he wanted, but I'll never forget his stare, or the notes he left behind. It felt like he wanted to remind me that no matter how far I go, he's still out there, in some way. I worked as a desk clerk at a roadside motel for almost 2 years. One of those simple places where people stop to rest during long trips. It was a quiet night, just like many others, on a random fall day. The cold was creeping into the reception area, and I distracted myself with a lukewarm cup of coffee while watching the TV mounted above the counter. The routine was usually dull, but something about that night made me uneasy. A man arrived around 10 p.m. alone, carrying a worn-out backpack. At first glance, he seemed normal, but there was something in his eyes, a hollow, unsettling look. He was tall, thin, wearing a shabby leather jacket, and his scruffy beard made him even more enigmatic. When I asked for ID to check him in, he shook his head and said he would pay in cash, no questions asked. At first I refused, but he insisted in a low, firm voice that didn't match his frail appearance. Something about him convinced me not to push further. Maybe it was the silence. I handed him the key to room 108 and watched as he walked down the hallway with light steps, almost floating. After that, the night went on without any notable events, at least until my shift ended. The next morning, everything seemed normal, until the cleaning staff called me, visibly upset. They told me room 108 was empty, completely empty. No backpack, no clothes, no sign that anyone had stayed there. Even the bed was perfectly made, as if no one had touched the sheets. My first reaction was to check the system to make sure I hadn't made a mistake during check-in, but there it was. Room 108, paid in cash, no ID. My stomach knotted. None of it made sense. Something was very wrong, and I knew I had to investigate. I decided to check the security cameras. Our reception was simple, but the cameras covered the hallways well. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I needed to understand how someone could just vanish without a trace. I started with the check-in time, and there he was, the man entering the hallway with his backpack. He walked slowly, almost as if counting his steps, before disappearing into room 108. The footage showed the hallway throughout the night, and I expected to see him leaving with his belongings, maybe in the early morning hours. But the truth was far stranger than I could have imagined. Around 3 a.m. he opened the door, not in a hurry, but with the same calculated calm as before, and looked both ways. Instead of heading to the parking lot, he walked in the opposite direction. He stopped in front of room 112, one of the occupied rooms that night. My heart started racing. I remembered the guest in room 112 clearly, a trucker who had checked in earlier, exhausted and not in the mood for small talk. All he wanted was a bed and silence. In the footage, the man stood in front of room 112 and, with something small in his hand, maybe a pin or some improvised tool, managed to unlock the door in seconds. He entered without hesitation and shut the door behind him, vanishing from the cameras. I scoured the footage for any other movement in the hallway, but it was as if he had dissolved inside the room. There was no sign of him leaving, no unusual activity. The hallway remained still until morning when the trucker left early, around 6 a.m. The idea that this man had spent the night in someone else's room sent chills down my spine. I wanted to speak to the trucker, but he was long gone. That's when I realized I might be dealing with something far beyond normal. The cleaning staff insisted I check room 112, and I admit I hesitated. Something about that strange man and the way he disappeared left me on edge. Still, I couldn't ignore what I had seen on the cameras. I grabbed a spare key and went to the room with the cleaning supervisor. The door was unlocked, which was odd, as the trucker had turned in his key at the reception. When we entered, the air felt colder, as if the heater had been off all night, even though it was autumn. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was used, towels were on the floor, just like any other guest would leave it. But in the corner of the room, something caught my eye. A small black notebook partially tucked under the armchair. I picked up the notebook carefully, hoping it might explain what had happened. The cover was blank, and inside, the pages were filled with scribbles, repeated words, disjointed drawings like spirals and overlapping eyes. The more I flipped through it, the more it seemed like the work of someone deeply disturbed. On one page, I found a list of names without any apparent context. I didn't recognize any of them, but the last name on the list stood out. It looked unfinished, with the final letter shakily written, as if done in a hurry. I closed the notebook, and at that moment, the cleaning supervisor whispered that she smelled something strange in the room. It was metallic, strong like dried blood. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, as if the presence of someone, or something, still lingered there. The following days were a blur of unease and paranoia. Freitas never returned for more information, and the manager never mentioned the incident again, as if he preferred to bury it and move on. But I couldn't. The notebook was still with me, locked in the reception desk drawer, and the list of names seemed to call out to me. Every time I opened the drawer, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if I were holding something dangerous. That's when I decided to research the names online. Using the motel's old computer, I started with the first name. To my shock, I found news of a missing person in a nearby town, dated just a few months ago. I moved to the next name, and the pattern repeated. Disappearances, no leads, always near motels or roadside accommodations. My hands trembled as I typed the next name. When I reached the last name on the list, the one that seemed unfinished in the notebook, my heart stopped for a moment. It was my name. Or almost. The last letter was scribbled, but there was no doubt. Someone had begun writing my name. It was as if the notebook was a kind of registry, a macabre prediction, and I was next in line. What had started as a strange story now felt like a direct threat. I thought about quitting the job, but something told me that wouldn't be enough to escape. That night, as the motel grew emptier, I decided to sleep in the reception area with the lights on and a screwdriver by my side, as if that could protect me from whatever was surrounding me. But it was that very night that everything came to a breaking point. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound coming from the hallway. Footsteps, light and rhythmic, like someone walking barefoot. My heart raced. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to listen more closely, but the sound abruptly stopped. I decided to check the cameras. When I opened the monitor, I almost dropped the cold coffee sitting on the counter. In the hallway, standing in front of the reception door, was the man from room 108. He didn't have his backpack this time, just the same black leather jacket hanging loosely on his thin shoulders. He was staring directly at the camera as if he knew I was there, watching. His face looked even paler, his eyes sunken into their sockets. He didn't move, just stood there for what felt like hours. Then he vanished from the screen. I rushed to the reception door, gripping the screwdriver tightly in my hand, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. The lights flickered irregularly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. There was no one there. At that moment, I made a decision. It was time to leave that place. The next day, I handed in my resignation and never went back. A few weeks later, I heard the motel had closed mysteriously without notice. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night or who or what that man was. The notebook disappeared, along with the motel's records, and all I'm left with is the memory of that empty stare. Every time I think about it, I feel like he's still out there, watching. And somehow, I know my name is still on that list, waiting to be completed.